Welcome to the Organic Advisor Call Series. I'm your host, Sam Oswald Tilton. I'm the training specialist with Oats and an independent organic advisor through my business, Glacial Drift Enterprises. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague, Amanda Gullett, who assists in the call series. Today's topic is NRCS cost share programs, practices for grain farmers and opportunities for advisors. And we're fortunate to be joined by Thomas Manley, who I'll introduce in a moment. This series is brought to you by the Organic Agronomy Training Service and Albert Lee Seed House. Albert Lee is a fourth-generation, family-owned, independent farm seed company with a full line of organic and non-GMO field crop seed and knowledgeable reps that I enjoy learning from. Thank you, Albert Lee, for your support of the call series. The episode is also supported through the United States Department of Agriculture Transition to Organic Partnership Program, which has been helpful for funding. TOPP's a program of the USDA that helps with funding transition to organic. A word about the Organic Agronomy Training Service. OATS is a partnership between universities, agronomists, crop consultants, nonprofit educators, and industry reps from throughout the country. We're a collaboratively managed training program for the agricultural advisors who work with organic farmers, transitioning farmers, and organic curious farmers. And we provide science-based training for the people and businesses that support organic farmers. If your organization is interested in custom training on organic practices, please feel free to reach out to me. Okay, this is our 8th and final episode of this season. And there are 2 whole past seasons of the series available on YouTube. And I'll put that link into the chat now if people want to avail themselves of the past seasons. And give me just one moment, please, while I do that. Amanda's ahead of me as usual. Thanks, Amanda. If you haven't done so already, I highly recommend signing up for the Oats newsletter mailing list to keep up to date on our in-person and virtual training events and other resources. And we'll put that link in the chat too. And that'll just let you know what's happening in the future. For example, like next season's call series, which I'm very excited about. Your feedback is helpful so that we get direction on bringing you the info that you want to know. And so we'll do a brief poll before the episode and a brief poll after. It should be showing up nowish on your screen, and go ahead and click on it. It'll take about 23 seconds. And in particular, let me know for next season, what are the speakers or topics that you'd like to hear from. I really enjoy getting direction from you all and making that kind of my homework to go out and make the call series reflect what you all want to learn about. Okay, that is it for housekeeping. Let's get started with today's discussion, and let me start by introducing you to our guest. Thomas Manley is the Wisconsin State Organic Conservation Specialist for Wisconsin NRCS and the Conservation Director at Marble-Seed. Tom supports producers in navigating NRCS organic programs, and he also trains and supports NRCS staff about organic practices. He's been providing technical assistance for the last 10 years and also farms with his wife to develop a permanent perennial-based grazing system. And so I've really been enjoying learning from Tom here over the last several months. I'm going to start out by asking Tom about his experience with organic cost share, and then I'll pose to him the questions that some of you asked when you registered. And like I said, please feel free to keep those questions coming in the chat. And as you do, I'll try to incorporate them, but no guarantees because time flies when we're talking agriculture. Okay, Tom, welcome. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks, Sam. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
And I will try to not be long-winded so we have some time for those questions.
Okay, well, you do your best, and I will try and not be rude if I have to interrupt to redirect, okay?
Feel free. Thank you.
So, Tom, to start, I had a lot of fun and a lot of fun learning from you in our preparation for this call, just about all the background for things that I kind of thought were pretty straightforward. And I really appreciate that you have hands-on experience with a lot of these programs as a farmer. And so I thought a good place to start would be if you could tell us, what are the cost share programs that you've used on your farm? And one thing that you really stressed to me is that, sure, these cost share programs are helpful. Hey, it's great to have free money and help from expert advisors. But that for you as a farmer, one thing you really learned from the program is that for years afterwards, the payoff really was in all of the work that you did in filling out the application and thinking of your farm as a system. And so you said that for you, sure, the practices were helpful, but the big picture of the mindset as an organic farmer was what really paid off. And so could you tell us, what are the practices that you've gotten funded on your farm, and how do you feel like, years after they were implemented, that kind of application process made you a better farmer?
Well, it all really boils down to the planning process itself and working with staff who are good planners and gifted planners and really good at working with farmers to fully understand like where they are and what their resources are and what their capacity is, and developing a system and implementing practices that make sense for their operation. And in my case, that was working with a grazing planner here in Wisconsin. She did a great job of understanding what our limitations were. Many of them were related to infrastructure. So it was more a matter of like not having the physical environment in which to manage in a way that we knew would get the results that we wanted, and developing a plan that let us do that. And that included not just the grazing management pieces and what to look for and how often to move the cows, but maybe every bit as importantly, or maybe more importantly, the fencing and the watering system pieces, and the ability to actually put cows where they need to be when they need to be there. And that was an infrastructure piece, and
Uh,
that whole systems planning that you alluded to. That is the nature of NRCS planning, and is also ideally the nature of how we farm organically, because I think organic has always been viewed through a systems lens, and I think that success in organic production tends to come when we approach it that way.
right. We're kind of asking natural processes to help with our farming more than kind of inputs. Even though your grazing is different than organic grain, which is the focus of this call
Yeah.
series, could you say a little bit more um, details about how that planning process made you think about your farm differently, or like you're saying, working with that advisor brought a different perspective.
Well, I think I came at it like a lot of producers do, especially when they first interact with NRCS. It usually starts with an application for a particular practice. And oftentimes, and I hope we get to touch on this later, but oftentimes that's really a kind of a convoluted way to approach it. When really, what I learned as a producer, benefiting from that support from NRCS, and as later, being a planner myself and supporting staff and working with staff, is that the value is really in that process. It's in those planning steps, and really having to look at your farm in terms of what are my problems here, and what are the resource concerns that are creating some of those problems, and then
Mhm.
start to think about what particular practices might be best suited to
Got it.
alleviate those problems.
Okay, so you're saying, sure, it might be tempting to go into it thinking, hey, I'm going to get so many dollars per acre for fencing or a windbreak, or yeah, that's what I really want. And I hear you saying, take a step back, don't assume that you know what you need, and maybe keep an open mind in that planning process because it's designed to kind of pull out weak points that maybe you weren't aware of.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
And again, I was lucky enough to work with a really good planner who really did take the time to understand where we were where we were at as producers, what our capacity was, what we had for equipment, what we were actually capable of implementing, and then fully understanding what the actual resource concerns were. And I think in many cases on a farm like mine that is mostly grass, it's much easier than when we're working with row crop farmers who oftentimes have completely different challenges, and usually more glaring resource concerns. When we're dealing with annuals, we're more likely to encounter those as part of our production.
Right, sure, in terms of just the tillage and erosion and yeah, okay. Um, so I hope during the next hour we'll kind of touch repeatedly on what are those big picture opportunities for farmers in this process. But like you alluded to, let's also talk about what is the process. So can you tell us? We'll touch on the specifics of what programs you think are most applicable for organic grain farmers. But start us off of like what is the process of getting cost share money? Who are the main players? What do people need to be aware of? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, ideally, the process starts with the planning. It starts with identifying where our problems are. What are as a producer, are there roadblocks? Is there something that's a hindrance to our ability to produce the quantity and quality of crop that we're looking to turn out from our farm? And it starts there by acknowledging that there's a problem, and then we look specifically to the resource concerns that might be creating that problem. And when I
Okay.
say resource concern, those are things that are very clearly defined by NRCS. And I think there's roughly 160, or excuse me, 47 right now, resource concerns um, that are identified, and they're typically lumped into categories. So there's soil resource concerns, there's water resource concerns, there's animal resource concerns, and we're looking to ideally identify all those resource concerns that exist on that farm, and that's part of that initial part of the planning process, that first phase of the planning process. What are the
Okay.
problems? Can we identify them? Can we assess them with NRCS tools, approved tools or methods as part of the planning criteria? And then once we're at that phase, now we know what we're up against. And in the case of row crop farmers, that's mostly going to be things like, we have sheet and rill erosion problems. We have potentially gully or class, or ephemeral gully erosion issues. We have soil organic matter depletion. We might have compaction issues. We're almost always going to have some level of organic matter depletion and compaction going on these farms. So
Okay.
those are the kinds of resource concerns that in a row crop operation we're most often going to be identifying.
And so my understanding is there's kind of three main players in this process. There's the farmer, there's the NRCS, and I feel like I'm somewhat familiar with those or how they work. But then there's the TSP, right? The technical service provider, that's sort of like a contractor, and they have to be NRCS approved, and the farmer has to choose them. And yeah, can you say a little bit more about like what is the TSP and how do they fit into the process of working with both NRCS and the farmer? It almost reminds me of organic certification, where you've got the farmer, you've got the USDA, and you've got kind of certifiers in the middle as kind of middlemen people.
It's not altogether unlike that at all. A technical service provider is an independent individual, sometimes an entity, a business entity that um, can provide planning support and technical assistance to producers. But the planning process doesn't always happen that way. I would say more often than not, at least up until some of the staffing reduction and changes that we've seen recently, very often NRCS staff would be out doing that planning work directly. We were getting to a place, and I'm wearing my marble seat hat here right now. I want to be clear that I'm not speaking on behalf of NRCS or the USDA in any way, but I think we know, and it's well recognized, that there's going to be reduced capacity for staff to do that planning work. And we've struggled, I think, for a long time to have the ability for staff to get out in the field as often as they want to or need to do that planning work directly. And that's where TSPs came in. Those technical service providers who they're trained, they have the background, and they're approved to write particular types of plans. They're in a position to provide that support to that producer to get to that place where they have a conservation plan and they're prepared to apply for and then ultimately implement practices. So those
Okay.
TSPs they're just independent folks, oftentimes CCAs, oftentimes folks who are providing technical assistance in some other capacity, um, having the ability to write a plan directly that producer can then take to NRCS.
Okay. And so I just pulled up a slide that you shared with me that we all learn differently, but I thought this would be good for kind of visual people around us. Could you talk through, uh, yeah, look, looking at the overall kind of process? How does it work? Where a farmer says, okay, my advisor just, Ashley Adair just watched this call series, and now she's all jazzed about conservation planning, and she thinks I should do this. What's the nuts and bolts of how it actually gets done, and at the end of the day, like how a farmer gets a check?
Well, I guess I'll start by saying how it's more often than not how it typically plays out, and this is counterproductive. So I guess I want to start there just to highlight what we maybe don't want to do, and
Yeah.
that is we start in phase 3 there, which is actually at the application and evaluation phase. The submitting an application for practices is step 8 of the 9-step planning process.
Well put. Yeah.
It, and oftentimes that is what and this has been the case for a long time, and I think a lot of it was the result of some really well-intentioned advocacy on the parts of lots of organizations and navigators and folks who were working with producers. And you can approach the process that way, and NRCS will take an application from a producer anytime they ask. If you walk in and want to fill out an application for any particular practice or program, you can do that anytime,
So you're saying there's
irrespective of.
no, it's not like a grant cycle where you got to apply in February. Like anytime you can turn it in.
There are, yep, it is year-long application period. There are batching periods and deadlines for applications to be considered for any particular round of funding or batching of applications for ranking. But I really always encourage producers to just essentially ignore those deadlines, because what often happens, and
Mhm.
again, this doesn't lead to the result that we want as producers. We want to get that support. I'm not going to lie. I mean, cost share is really important to a lot of farms. It made a huge difference on my farm in terms of my ability to do the things I do. I know that's true for all the producers I work with. But oftentimes we want to jump right to that step, and it oftentimes results in an application that's less likely to get funded. So ideally, we start this process in phase one by, again, identifying those problems, working to use the planning criteria and the NRCS assessment tools to identify those resource concerns and quantify them in a way that's consistent with planning criteria. Then we get to what is maybe the most important part of that process, and that's phase two. That is when we start looking at we formulate potential alternatives, changes in our management to address those resource concerns. And there might be a number of practices that are potentially applicable for any given resource concern. Now it's a matter of finding the one that adequately addresses that concern, but also meets with the objectives, those producer objectives, their ability to implement it, their capacity, their labor resources, whatever it might be. So
Okay.
that is, I think, the place where good planners really shine is understanding this is what's happening on the farm. We can see, oftentimes you can see it. It's like, obviously we have a sheet and rail erosion problem here. Now there might be 5 or 6 or 10 different practices we could potentially implement that could address that resource concern. What's the one that's the right fit for this farm and in the context of their overall plan?
Right. So, okay. So again, we could just apply, but one, you'll have a weaker application and maybe less likely to get the funding. But two, you're really missing out on the meat of this, which is like meet with your TSP. They know what they're doing. And before you already decide what you're getting funding for, don't put the cart before the horse. Just like look through your farm as a system and like look for those weak points and take advantage of that opportunity. Uh,
Exactly.
okay. So let's say um, got it. So let's say I have you out to the farm or out to the farm or the farmer I'm working with, and I chat with you beforehand, what have been the issues we've been working through with them, something like that. We go through this great planning process. And now we start to think, okay, there's whatever you said, 47 different programs we could get cost share through. We're here to learn about organic grain. What do you see as commonly the type of programs that organic grain farmers and the advisors that work with them, what programs should they be aware of? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess maybe I'll start by defining some terms just for clarity.
Yeah.
Programs refers to um, things like EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, or CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program. These are large federally funded pools that's where the money comes from, that ultimately makes its way to that farmer to help support their implementation of a practice. That
Okay.
160, that is the number, roughly the number. I'm not sure if it's even exactly 160, but it's 160-ish, the number of practices that NRCS recognizes at the national level anyway. Not every state necessarily recognizes or utilizes them all, but so there's lots and lots of practices that are potentially available to solve resource concerns. Those practices are funded through those programs.
Got it.
So in
So
terms of
programs versus practices.
yeah, the
Programs are where the money
overarching.
comes from. Practices are kind of what you get the money for, what you're doing.
Exactly.
Okay.
And those overarching programs, the two that are probably most worth talking about are EQIP and CSP. And usually the way we approach those is that EQIP Equip is the starting place. Like we have a gaping wound, and we've got to put a bandage on it. We've got clearly identified resource concerns. It's going to take some significant change in management or addition of infrastructure to address that resource concern. And that's really what Equip is designed to do, is to provide that kind of cost share support so that you can implement something that is a pretty significant change in your management.
Okay. And
Whereas
can you give us some kind of money? Give us some kind of rubber meets the road. Um, on a grain farm, what are some of those like gaping wounds that commonly get identified?
I would say, I mean, we see this driving around the countryside all the time. The grass waterways. Typically, you're going to see grass waterways going through a field because there was likely, some type of gully erosion. We had ephemeral or classic gully erosion going on, and this was a way to control that concentrated flow, to slow that water down, to spread it out, to capture some of the particulates that are coming off the field in that permanently vegetated strip. So
Mhm.
that is an example of some place where we have an obvious problem. Like in some cases you can see it from space, kind of
Right.
problem going on the farm. And now this is the practice we're going to implement that does a good job of alleviating that concern initially. Another good one might be like, I'm in the driftless over here, that part of Wisconsin. We used to see a lot. We don't see as much as maybe we should in contour farming. Farming on contour, or even strip cropping, where you're going to be growing strips and alternating crops and trying to keep at one of those strips more or less permanently vegetated, or a little thicker, a crop like
Right.
alfalfa or something that's going to maybe have a perennial phase like that, in an effort to slow down some of that sheet and rill and some of the other issues we'll see on those kinds of farms, particularly in highly sloped and silty places like where I live.
Okay.
So
And if
those
you're, I'm sorry, go on.
I was just going to say those are some examples of like some things that might be applied right off the bat when we obviously have a problem.
Okay. And then, are you finding this conversation useful? Hit the thumbs up button to help others discover it too. And if you'd like more conversations like this, click subscribe and turn on the bell icon for notifications. Okay, and then kind of to your, I don't know, bigger picture, meta point of like planning and farm and or as organism and systems, if we're seeing those initial programs or practices as like stopping the bleeding or stop the gaping wound, okay, cool. We stop that, we put in our grass right away, we're not exporting our topsoil. Well, are we done, or like is there a refinement after that? What's next?
That's exactly what we're aiming for, and this is consistent with the organic regulations. It's consistent with sort of our organic values and ethos of that I think we all share as organic producers. The idea of continual improvement, and that's really where CSP comes in. The Conservation Stewardship Program is really designed to
Uh,
continue to encourage and incentivize and support producers who are moving toward that continual improvement. So we're looking to enhance what might already be good management. We're looking to enhance that management long term to further improve that outcome.
Okay, so we've got Equip and CSP. These are programs, and within each of them, there are practices. And so the practices of Equip tend to be for stopping the bleeding, and the practices for TSP tend to be for just kind of making improvements over time.
Well, and they may very well be the same practices. They may have the same practice name, same practice codes.
Okay.
But what we're looking at in CSP is, are we enhancing that management even further? So I would think, in what might be a good example for a crop farm, if we had a conservation crop rotation that was fairly simple, I think by organic standards. We're putting a small grain crop in after we're taking off corn, that kind of thing. You're going to technically meet the requirements for conservation crop rotation. You may also be technically meeting the diversity requirements for your certifier for organic certification.
Okay.
But obviously, there's a lot of room for improvement in that rotation. So now, if we start stretching that rotation out, we start inserting some more things that aren't maybe necessarily cash crops or very different cash crops. We're doing a better job of alternating grasses and leafy legumes and what have you. If we're introducing more of that, more diversity, if we're putting a perennial phase in there, if we're putting 2 or 3 years of alfalfa in the middle of that rotation. Now, these are things that we might be able to find support through CSP for to continue that improved management over time.
Okay. The more you talk about this, the more it seems to me that I would, as a producer, I would want to be working with a TSP that knows organic, or that it could really be a weakness if they're not familiar with organic practices. Uh, yeah, could we pivot a little bit to choosing a TSP to work with? Do you have any tips of how do we find someone that like gets an organic grain farm, or we're not having to kind of train them up? Yeah, what's a good way for advisors or farmers to choose? Right, there's that giant spreadsheet online. I put the link in there. We've seen there's so many TSPs that are certified. How do we choose who to work with?
Well, that directory, that CSP directory, well, you can filter by state, and you can often filter by, you can also filter by the practices that they're approved to offer support with. And there's a couple of different ways that TSPs can offer support to producers. They can write what are called conservation planning activities, CPAs.
Okay.
I think there are currently 6 CPAs. One of them is support producers through transitions. That's a CPA 138. So that is specifically a plan that a TSP would write for a producer that is transitioning their operation to certified production. And as part of that process, again, identifying those resource concerns, implementing practices that address those, but doing it in the context of their transition to certified production,
Okay.
which I think is really can be very valuable to a producer who's transitioning, who is also developing their organic systems plan for the first time, and trying to, as part of that, we need to identify what is our plan for how we address and protect resources on our farm. And so it's helpful in the development of that OSP, but it's also helpful in terms of that producer really getting a handle on what their changes in production are going to look like. And sometimes this can be most challenging when we're working with a conventional producer who's coming at it, through that what is, more often than not the conventional mindset of, when I have a problem, I apply something. Whereas,
Right.
organic is the flip side of that. It's we're doing everything we can to avoid applying anything. So we're really looking at this like, I want to prevent and avoid and monitor and only suppress a problem when I have to. So
Okay.
that particular planning activity can be really useful. But there are several others: nutrient management planning, pest management planning. There's a soil health one that was recently introduced. So these are all planning activities that a TSP can be certified to support a producer with. And that
Okay.
plan, that CPA, is essentially the first 7 steps of the planning process. What it results in is what's called a schedule of practices, which is the decisions that producer made in terms of the practices they are motivated to implement on their farm. And
Okay.
that's the perfect time to step into that application space and apply for those practices over a period of time where you're confident you can implement them. Um,
And so it's not, so you identified CPA 138, which is a practice that is focused, just for organic or transitioning farmers. Are there any other programs that are kind of organic specific?
there
Sorry,
there
sorry, any other practices that are organic specific?
There is one that was introduced as part of the Organic Transition Initiative. It is a practice that is in interim status right now. It is called organic management. It is referred to by its interim status number of 823.
Okay.
And some folks might be familiar with that. That is a management practice, very much like pest management would be a management practice, or grazing management. Prescribed grazing is a management practice. That where organic management is similar in that it may include several supporting practices that you would implement at the same time. And it's been my experience that almost always it does include supporting practices. So that organic management might be the overarching umbrella practice, but you could have any number of supporting practices that go along with that. But that
Okay, so again, if I'm hearing you right, farmers or advisors don't need to go into this feeling like, oh, I need to know the list of practices and have looked through them at all and know which one I'm applying for. It's like, don't even worry about it. If you're working with a TSP who's good, they're going to look through your whole farm. You're going to understand where the weaknesses are, and then they're going to help you. They're the professionals. They'll know, hey, these are practices that I think are going to be helpful for where you're at.
yeah. And
Okay.
ultimately, the decision is the producers. I mean, that's something to always remember is that as farmers, we ultimately make the decision about what we are implementing, and to some degree, some flexibility in terms of the timing of those things too. But ultimately, the farmer is the decision maker. The TSP hopefully is providing, good guidance in terms of what practices might make sense. So they have enough of enough experience, whether that's, direct agronomy experience or experience with these particular practices or both, that they're in a
Yeah.
position to really advise that producer well.
Okay. And then, so if I can zoom out a little bit, on the call series, we're somewhat, Midwest focused, but it's really neat. We got people joining from all over the country. Can you give us an idea? Are there regional differences between the applications or the programs or the TSPs, or is it all homogenous? Just for people around the country, yeah, what should people be aware of depending on where they live?
It would be a lot easier if there were fewer differences across regions and states. It is challenging because states, and rightly so, states have a lot of latitude and flexibility in terms of how they adopt a particular practice and what that means. So states can um, they can't change what's called the general criteria within a practice, but they can change additional criteria and considerations and kind of how they view that practice and what that means in terms of implementation on the ground. And that's
Okay.
necessary because we're all farming in different environments, different soil types, different
Right.
amounts of rainfall, all those kinds of things. So states do have some flexibility there. They also have some flexibility in terms of how they roll out particular programs when they,
Yeah.
their application deadlines and those kinds of things. But the process that a producer should follow in any particular state to hopefully, get it, lead to a good result is going to be the same.
Okay. And is that right that the EQIP and CSP program budgets are set by state so that you might apply and NRCS might say, hey, sorry, our budget for Missouri is already full this year. You'll have to wait till next year.
That is, I mean, this is true for conservation funding generally. They're just it. All of these programs are oversubscribed, meaning we have more applications than the
Right.
programs are capable of funding,
And
and
so
that
that's
is
kind of to your earlier point of like, kind of don't worry about the deadline. Just apply as soon as you finally make the time for it. And then at least you're in the queue for when it opens up.
yep. And
Okay.
if you're starting from a place where you've got a good conservation plan and you're applying for, multiple practices, more than one practice, those are things that are going to impact your ranking. So how your
Mm,
application is ranked, this is a competitive process. And so, I mean, in a nutshell, the ranking process is we're looking at, what is the resource concern and is this a priority? Because different states can prioritize different resource concerns.
right.
National can prioritize different resource concerns. Oftentimes, like I know where my farm is here, we're in a very very narrow strip that is part of the Mississippi River Basin Initiative. So
Hmm.
there are very clear priorities that have been spelled out right here. So all of those things will impact how an application is ranked. But if you the better job you've done of planning on the front end,
Yeah.
in a nutshell, that's going to have a positive impact on how your application ranks.
Okay, and I'm starting to just see a lot of the kind of connection. So I'm guessing if I'm working with a TSP, I want them to be, and say I'm living in Minnesota, I want them to be very Minnesota focused and maybe even kind of regionally focused, like your example of, hey, just along the Mississippi, they're going to want to be aware of that. What has my state NRCS been funding lately? What have they set as priorities? Let's make sure we're aware of that and kind of applying towards that.
And it's not uncommon for TSPs to work across state lines within a region. So, like,
Okay.
they might work in a 2 or 3 or 4 state area, so they do become familiar with the types of resource concerns they're most likely to see and what works in their region and what doesn't.
Okay.
And they're also likely to be pretty familiar with the programs themselves. So that's the other piece of this is the programs have different funding pools oftentimes. So within equip, there are several potential funding pools that a producer can apply to. And so it's a matter oftentimes of getting good guidance from staff as part of that application process in terms of like where is your application likely to be more competitive. And in the
Yep.
case of organic producers, we not right now we have two dedicated fund pools for organic. One of them is the National Organic Initiative. It's been around for a number of years now. They tend to be smaller contracts. They're available to producers in any certification status, so exempt, transitioning, or already certified. And it's been my experience that is a fund pool where we don't see quite as many applications. There seems to be a greater likelihood that producers get a contract when they're applying to that fund pool, but they tend to be smaller contracts. And these are
Right.
oftentimes already certified producers who have a history of good resource management already and may have had contracts for equip or CSP in the past as well.
Okay.
Um, the other fund pool is the Organic Transition Initiative fund pool that is also part of equip, and that is open, but that is open only to producers who are actively transitioning ground. So that is money that
Right.
is specifically set aside for ground that's being transitioned.
Okay. Um, I think it's very important to be realistic, and I think recently we're in a period where there's more change, there's a little less stability. I think everyone needs to be kind of a little more nimble, and with that comes more opportunities and more pitfalls. And as much as you feel comfortable, can you kind of look into the future with NRCS and cost share just because budgets and staffing, a lot of things are changing. There's the way things were and the way things are, but also the way things will be. Yeah, anything in your mind, just with your years of experience on this, what should people be aware of how this program might be changing?
Yeah, I don't want to get too deep in the policy weeds, but the fact is, I mean, I think everybody on this call probably knows the Farm Bill has been held up, where that process has not been going smoothly. We've seen some marker bills and have some sense of where the House and the Senate might land in terms of funding levels for conservation broadly, which includes not just funding these programs and the monies that go directly to farmers, but also monies that are in the technical assistance budget to pay TSPs, to provide for partnership or cooperative agreements for organizations to provide some of that planning support. Those monies, it appears that we might be headed toward fairly level funding on those things, but it was funding that was still inadequate to meet the need. The fact is, there's more need for technical assistance, and there's more need for those financial assistance pieces through those programs than the Farm Bill has ever really provided for. So, I guess I would say one thing we can all do as producers is make sure that we're reaching out to our representatives and letting them know how
Yep.
important that conservation funding is broadly.
Yep.
Um, but one thing I can say confidently, and I think that this is going to be the case for the foreseeable future, is that NRCS staff, who have always worked hard, they've always been overworked and understaffed, are going to that situation is just going to be exacerbated, and they're going to be focused, I think, largely on meeting those program delivery needs. And I think there's a likelihood that the agency is going to become more reliant on TSPs and other outside affiliated planners to
Okay.
help pick up some of that planning work.
So let's pick up that thread, I suppose. So this is the Organic Advisor Call series, and it seems to me that writing these conservation plans for farmers as a TSP might be a line of work that some organic advisors want to add to their services. Could you tell me how does an advisor turn into a TSP? That's certified to write these plans.
Yeah. Well, in some cases, they're making it really, really easy. This is a fairly recent development within the last, year. They have expedited the path for CCAs to become TSPs. So some of the requirements that used to exist, in terms of like boxes you'd have to check to get to that point, they're waiving many of those for existing CCAs in an effort to get more TSPs out there in a position to provide that support. And I think honestly, folks who are already providing a technical assistance, particularly folks in the organic community who are providing organic specific technical assistance to producers, are are they're the best delivery mechanism for those TSP services. And
Okay.
I really think that the ideal situation is that we get to a place in the near future here where we have a lot of skilled planners who are housed in organizations that are providing that technical assistance. They might be organizations that are part of the TOPP partnership that providing some of that technical assistance and mentorship. They might be agronomists who are working, you know, uh, in any capacity to provide that. If they're that's really the ideal vehicle, I think, for providing those that planning support.
Are there any are there any further details about being a TSP or how they're paid that would help a current advisor decide, hey, do I want to seek out TSP work?
Yeah. Well, the TSPs are paid based on, um, readily available. You can if you can't find it by navigating through the sites that I know some of the links that we're hoping to share later, in terms of what they get paid for any particular planning activity or what's called a DIA, a design and implementation activity. There are lots of things that a TSP can provide to a producer. They're all going to have a different, cost for the producer. And
Okay.
more often than not, the way this works is the producer applies for that technical assistance support. They'll get a contract that allows them to help pay for that TSP services. And in many cases, it pays in full for those TSP services. But the amount that producer is reimbursed from NRCS, that's all publicly available information. So, and some of the links we're going to provide will get you there. Uh,
Okay.
but if you have questions, you can reach out to the programs folks in your individual at NRCS at your state office in any given state, and I'm sure you can find that information from programs as well. Um, in a nutshell, um, I think it's difficult for a TSP to, and this isn't always the case because there are lots of TSPs who are approved to do different types of plans and design a number of practices, and they stay pretty busy, and they can be a full-time TSP and make a living. I think in
Okay.
many cases in the organic world, we're going to more often find that we have multiple revenue streams coming in, and the TSP work is one of them.
Um, so kind of regarding that, actually, a question from one of our listeners, Stephen. He says that because his local NRCS office is so slammed, if I'm reading his comment right, they made a rule that they won't come out to your farm until you apply first, get in the queue, and then once you have an application in, they're willing to come out and help move that forward. Is that just kind of based on each local office by office, or is that something that's pretty common?
Well, it might be becoming increasingly common, but again, we're circumventing that planning work. And in
Yeah.
many cases, depending on the practice that they're applying for, this is certainly true for something like organic management, that practice standard. It's going to force everyone to circle back and still perform those first 7 steps of the planning process. So it's not like we can't eliminate them. The staff is still going to need to find the time to identify those resource concerns because everything the agency does starts there. Everything they do, all of the cost share monies and the financial assistance are designed to resolve a resource concern.
Okay.
And so at some point, somebody has to come back and identify and plan that practice for that farm.
Okay.
And I guess I'm maybe not surprised that was the response that they got, but I think that's in part because oftentimes they don't know there just aren't enough TSPs or other planners to that they can refer them to do that planning work on the front end.
Okay. Um, I'm going to ask you one of my favorite questions here in a moment. But before I'll just remind our audience that we got, though, I don't know, about 10ish minutes left or something. So feel free, if there's other things that you want to learn from Tom, feel free to put a note in the chat there, and I'll do my best to kind of pose those to Tom. But in the meantime, Tom, let me ask, what do you feel like farmers or advisors often get wrong about cost share programs and practices? Are there kind of stereotypes that you feel like are often hobbling people?
Well, maybe the biggest one is just the idea that an NRCS contract is a grant of some kind, that it and not a clear appreciation for the fact that those monies are there and they exist solely to address and improve resource outcomes on our farms. And it is a payment to
Oh,
help support a change in management. That's really what it is. And I
yeah.
think that's an important thing to remember and not lose sight of. Um,
If I'm hearing you right, it reminds me, I've just been reading some articles lately from the 40s and 50s when people, very much had the Dust Bowl in mind and, like, yeah, large scale ecological disaster. And you're kind of saying this isn't so much about supporting farmers or putting dollars in their pockets. It's really about, hey, our land is a shared resource. Once we all die, like, our children and grandchildren inherit it. And we're really kind of subsidizing the land here.
that's why the agency exists, and that's why the cost share through the agency exists, is for that reason.
Okay.
Now, that being said, it can be oftentimes it can be transformative for a farm. And I think especially when we're working with maybe newer producers, and that, they're somewhere in that first 10 years of production maybe, and they're still figuring some things out. I think it can be really transformative for those farms. And I especially think that's true for transitioning farms as well, farmers that are moving towards certified production. I think that incorporating NRCS into your transition and into your organic systems plan and your management going forward, I think can really pay dividends for the long haul.
Okay. I've appreciated in our calls kind of sharing resources with listeners if they want to follow up, learn more, something like that. We shared the TSP link earlier, and in the chat now, I'll put 4 links that Tom pulled out for us for producers. And as I do, Tom, could you say a word kind of about each of those 4 pages, just why people would go there or what they would learn? And the first one
Sure.
I'll put in there is about Equip Organic Initiative.
Yeah, that one is going to be that's going to be the NOI, the original organic specific fund pool. Again,
Okay.
that one is available to producers in any certification status, so exempt, transitioning, or already certified. It's the contract limits are smaller than you would find with regular equip, but again, it's a less competitive fund pool, and it is if you're an already certified producer, it seems like the fund pool you're more often than not going to want to look to first in terms of where you're submitting an application, what funding pool you're submitting it to.
Okay.
Um,
And then
it
I'll put in the organic transition webpage.
Yep, Organic Transition Initiative. That's that OTI fund pool. That was rolled out at the same time as TOPP and all the other pieces of the Organic Transition Initiative. This is the NRCS piece. That is it's part of EQIP. It funds EQIP contracts. It is reserved for transitioning acres. So if it really that
Right.
funding is only available to transitioning producers.
Okay.
Um,
And then
and
I'll put in the link for the technical assistance conservation planning page.
that is a page that really just looks overall at like the conservation planning process and what to expect and what the steps are and what we're hoping to accomplish in each of those steps. So it's really just kind of a nice like holistic overview of how the process works and why it has value.
Okay. And then the last one here is kind of the farmer's guide that seems kind of, short and sweet.
Yeah, that one is specific about to cart and to the ranking process and understanding how your application is going to be evaluated and compared to other applications. It is I think those are some helpful insights in terms of what makes one application rank higher than another, and it all
Yeah.
comes back to predicted outcomes, like what are the resource concerns, what are the practices we're looking to implement to address those resource concerns, and what do we predict that impact is going to be on that resource concern.
Okay. Tom, I think we can kind of start winding down, and I always appreciate learning from you. And one thing I've learned in my experience with you is there's never enough time. I always finish. I'm like, man, I wanted to ask one more thing, and let me turn it over to you if I may. We were able to cover, I hope, kind of a broad spectrum of things that farmers and advisors might think through in terms of these cost share programs. Is there anything else you want to say? Anything maybe we didn't touch on, or yeah, anything else that'd be helpful for people to hear?
I would maybe want to stress the value of one particular practice that I think is really underutilized on farms generally and on organic farms specifically, and that is nutrient management planning. There are a lot of TSPs who are prepared to write nutrient management plans. If we have TSPs who are approved to work to write transition plans for organic producers and have some skill set to work specifically with organic producers, I would maybe encourage them to also become nutrient management planners, because I do see a real opportunity for producers to kind of really understand how they're cycling nutrients through on their farm. And oftentimes, I mean, I think a lot of organic farmers are really good at just having a sort of intuitive sense of what they're applying. But I'm aware of situations where you go out and you start taking soil samples and you start really looking at, like, um, how much phosphorus am I building up here? What are my actual needs? And I think this is something that we want to do in organic, and that is reduce those inputs. And I think
Right.
nutrient management is a really good way for farmers to take a hard look at what do these crops actually need, and is there a way for me to be pulling back on what I'm applying? And particularly, I think about, I know a lot of row crop farmers are using poultry litter as
Hmm.
a source. We
Hmm.
know we got a lot of phosphorus in that product generally. It's an opportunity for us to maybe not apply in an effort to meet the NP and K requirements for any particular crop, but really look at, like, okay, can I apply to make sure I've got enough phosphorus, enough potassium, and then grow some of my nitrogen as part of my conservation crop rotation? So can I extend that crop rotation? Can I have a legume or even a perennial legume phase that fills in some of those pieces? And I think nutrient management planning, the process of really taking a hard look at it, testing your soil, testing your inputs, and trying to reduce my inputs over time. That's one of the biggest benefits of organic, is not just the price premium we get on the other end, but the
Yeah.
opportunity to reduce our inputs.
Well, and I feel like I don't know, you couldn't have wrapped it up or put a bow on our conversation any better, just to where we started of a lot of times this process allows farmers just to be better farmers, to be more aware of what's happening on their farm, to lower costs based on practices. Yeah, I can see how that would be kind of powerful for people to learn more. Well, it's happened. What did they used to say on Car Talk? You've wasted another hour, but it's happened. Time flies when we're talking agriculture, and here we are almost at 1 o'clock. Tom, thanks so much for taking the time to work with me and share your experience with all of us on this episode.
It was a pleasure, Sam. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Before you all leave your desks, if you could please take a moment to fill out our evaluation. It'll take approximately 47 seconds. And your opinion will really help us improve these calls. And we'll put a link to that survey in the chat now. This is the eighth and final episode of the Organic Advisor Call Series for this 2025 series. And I've been really happy to hear from many of you over the season about what you've been enjoying learning about, the guests, the topics. And I'm really happy to say that we're planning next year's season. So please do send me an email, call me, however, but get a hold of me and let me know who you want to learn from and what topics you want to learn about for next season's call series, which we'll be contacting you about in a little bit. Until then, thanks a lot for joining, and I wish you a safe and bountiful harvest.